Yeah, okay.
Later this week.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'll do that. Thank you. Thank you again. All right.
Please, everybody, keep your computer muted, and we will communicate through the chat. If you have any question, just add it to the chat, and I will remind Lisa that there is a question, and she will be able to answer them when they come up or at the end. It depends the kind of question. All right, well, let's start officially here. My name is Henriette Ouden. I am working with the University of Maryland, Eastern Shore, better known as UMES. We have a very nice initiative here where the university pays me to do what I love, and that is growing herbs and train people on this. Now, I have always felt a little uncomfortable training people on the soil because I am not a soil specialist. And honestly, my knowledge doesn't go any further than using different kind of cover crops and add some compost. So we decided to ask Lisa Garfield, who is a soil specialist and works at Future Harvest. This is a local Maryland. We are in Maryland, obvious. Future Harvest is a Chesapeake Bay organization, and I will give it over to Lisa to introduce herself and start this. Lisa, are you there?
Great, thanks, Henry.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Lisa Garfield. I work for Future Harvest, and I primarily work on a project called the Million Acre Challenge, which is a statewide and regional initiative with the aim of advancing soil health and regenerative practices across 1 million acres of Maryland and Chesapeake region agricultural land by 2030. And we do that by offering soil testing and soil health benchmarking with partners at PASA Sustainable Agriculture. We do offer a lot of farmer education and farmer-to-farmer networking opportunities because we know farmers like to learn from each other. And I was formerly a farmer as well, and developing soil health resources and farm profitability models. So you can learn more about that project at millionacrechallenge.org. And today, we're just going to be focusing on soil health really in the context of growing quality herbs. And when we think about soil health as a concept, we're usually referring to this definition up here, the continued capacity of soil to function as a vital and living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. And in order to build or maintain that capacity in the soil, we want to pay attention to this nexus right here in the middle of the physical and biological and chemical attributes of the soil. And so the physical attributes include soil texture. That is something that you can't change about the soil. It really depends on what the parent material was that is the basis of your soil. But it will very much influence the way you manage for soil health and the way you manage for crop health. Aggregate stability is a measure of the ability of the soil aggregates, which are the particles that bind together to resist breaking apart when they're exposed to any kind of disturbance. It can be, even something as small as a raindrop or water and wind erosion, and like the shrinking and swelling that happens with different moisture levels or temperature levers, and how it responds to soil disturbance like tillage. And aggregate stability is also, it's kind of a dual indicator. It's not just a physical indicator, it's also an indicator of biological health, because the soil microorganisms are creating glues that help keep those soil aggregates formed. And so if you have poor aggregate stability, it may also be an indication that you don't have a really active microbial community producing those glues that are helping form good aggregates. And things like water dynamics, porosity, That's really how your soil can store water for use during periods of drought, and how the water will drain through the soil when we have these really heavy rain events that most of us are getting very, very familiar with. And then the biological, we're referring to the microfauna, and things like protozoans, nematodes, tardigrades in soil. Macrofauna are slugs, millipedes, centipedes, worms, and then of course the microorganisms, the bacteria and the fungi, roots and organic matter. And then the chemical attributes. And this is the one that we're most familiar with, because when we send off soil tests, most labs are just looking at the chemical attributes of the soil. They're looking, you'll get your pH, your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium content, maybe some of the, maybe calcium and sulfur, and then things like your cation exchange capacity, which is very closely tied to your soil texture. And that is that's a measure of the negative charge that's on your soil colloids, your soil particles that can hold on to other nutrients in the soil. And so cation exchange is a property that really is going to tell you about the capacity of your soil to supply nutrients for plant uptake. So that's kind of the quick rundown of what we're talking about now today when we talk about soil health.
Thank you. Can I interrupt you for a second?
Sure.
I wanted to ask everybody to please turn off your microphone so we don't hear people moving around. Other question for you specifically, Lisa, how can you measure the physical or the biological situation of your soil?
Well, there are soil test labs that do soil health tests. Cornell is an example of that. Or there's the Haney test that measures biological activity. There's also at-home tests that you can do. There's slake tests, and there's even an app for that you can do on home. And a slake test will a big glass of water and some kind of a mash or a strainer. You put a clod of soil in there and you see how well it holds together, whether it just kind of falls apart. So that's an in-field assessment that you can do on your own, or you can send it to a lab. Many labs won't have that as part of their basic soil test, but they may have it as an add-on.
Did I lose you?
No. And then I'm gonna I'll talk a little bit more about measuring for soil texture in just a few slides.
Okay.
So the other thing that we want to keep in mind that's a good kind of overarching concept is the soil health principles. And these were developed by NRCS. There are 4 or 5, depending on how you count them. Maximize continuous living roots, which you can do through crop rotations, relay crops, switching from an annual to a perennial system, growing cover crops in between your cash crops, which we'll talk about quite a bit, or just having a more perennial system. Maximizing biodiversity, and that means both above and below ground biodiversity. So, what happens above often reflects what happens below. So making sure to have good crop rotations, planting cover crop mixtures, intercropping, companion planting, things like that we'll talk a little bit more about. That all is feed more diversity below ground. So having more, different communities of microbes in the soil. And then minimizing disturbance, and that, again, that refers to the physical, biological, and chemical disturbance. So we're not just talking about tillage when we talk about disturbance. That would be the mechanical piece of that. And, whenever possible, think about what tools you're using. Are there other options? But also think about the substances, the amendments you're adding, and whether those are disturbing your soil biology. And when you work your soil, if you are going to use any tillage, doing it when the soil is too wet. which can cause compaction, and then maximizing soil cover. And that would be keeping some residues after you harvest, using mulch, and again, reducing tillage. And then my new favorite soil health principle is understanding context. So not all of the same practices work for everybody. So it's really important to kind of take a critical look at your system and think about which ones make the most sense, what resources you have, what tools you have, what you're growing, and even what your personal likes and dislikes are. You don't want to decide to change your system to something that would benefit soil health if it's something that is just not realistic because you hate doing that particular task. So really good to consider your own position in this farm ecosystem. And so today the context also is, what's going to work for growing herbs, what's important for growing herbs. So these are some of the management considerations that you want to think about. Your soil texture. Oh, sorry, seems like I somehow got muted. This is a soil texture triangle. Maybe you've seen it before, and where the percentage of sand, silt, and clay that makes up your soil will determine where you fall on this texture triangle. And different textures have really different characteristics. So clay soils are very tiny particles. They tend to have a higher cation exchange capacity, meaning they can hold a lot more nutrients in the soil. They have a strong negative charge, and then a lot of surface area because the particles are so small. And that means they have the ability to hold on to a lot of nutrients that can then become available for plant use. The downside is with those small particles, you don't always have as much pore space. And you need about 50% pore space that can be taken up by air and water in order to provide a good home for soil microorganisms that are then needed to make those nutrients available. So if you have a heavy clay soil, you would want to think about ways to lighten that soil up. And you really could do that by adding organic matter. Whether it's growing cover crops, which is really always the best case scenario, but also adding compost and just thinking about other ways without too much disturbance of making sure that there are channels for the water to flow and that there's ways to get air and moisture into that soil. You can also have problems with compaction in heavy clay soils. On the opposite end of the spectrum, very sandy soils have a very low cation exchange capacity and so have a harder time holding on to nutrients. So you may want to think about how you apply nutrients, applying them in smaller amounts throughout the season rather than all at once, because there's a good chance they're going to leach through. And you can also have a harder time retaining moisture. But the positive side to sandy soil is that it really resists compaction. There tends to be pretty good pore space, so it drains well when we have heavy rain events, and it warms up more quickly in the spring. So often you can get out into the field more quickly. And then the ideal is really the loam in the middle, sandy loam being considered kind of the easiest soil to work with. And moving on to existing constraints, also really important management consideration. The constraint could be your soil texture, in which case you'd want to focus on adding organic matter. You kind of can't go wrong with aiming to add organic matter. It could be existing compaction from previous land use. It could be a slope that you're on. So something to think about. And the crop fertility needs, also very important. applying kind of a precision nutrient management approach so that you're not throwing away money. There's a lot of amendments out there, a lot of people trying to sell you things, and it can be easy to think that one product is going to be a silver bullet, but you should really be thinking about the individual crop needs, and get your soil test done, find out what nutrients are already there, and then think about what kind of amendments make the most sense. Some of the other considerations would be whether you're growing roots or shoots, and whether they're an annual crop or a perennial, or maybe it's a short-lived perennial like a biennial crop. And then the timing, and thinking about what are the opportunities there for cover cropping. For instance, how can you, are there niche windows between crops that you could keep living roots in the ground by a very short-lived, like a buckwheat cover crop, or can you design your system to incorporate like a full year fallow of cover crops without giving up on too much space or farm income.
And Lisa, if I can add this, I asked Lisa to add the timing, because the herbs have a different timing than people that grow just vegetables. Often the tropical herbs are going to be harvested later, and then you run out of time, out of the standard timing to add or to start growing a cover crop. And Lisa will talk about that later. The one thing that I realized is also important if you have sandy soil, more towards the sandy side, and you grow roots. If we don't think about what does it take up, there's a very practical reason. The more sandy you are, the easier it is to harvest your roots and to clean them. If you are in heavy clay soil or almost heavy clay soil, it's going to be very hard to clean your roots because the clay sticks to your roots, and that might lead to damage the outer layer of the roots. So it's not only for the quality of your product, it's also very important for the ease of harvesting and the safety of the harvesting, because as soon as you damage the outer layer, you have a chance of getting an infection there. Something can creep in. So it's not just what feed is there in the soil, it's also a very practical reason to really stand still with this. Just want to add that, Lisa. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So this is just a kind of a fun, quick test you can do for yourself. If you're not sure exactly what soil texture you have, you just need a mason jar with a lid. Fill the jar halfway with soil and add some water, and then shake it for several minutes so that all of those soil particles are in suspension. And you'll see that the sand in your soil, if you have sand in your soil, is much heavier, and it's going to settle to the bottom very, very quickly, in a matter of minutes. Then the silt layer, slightly smaller particles than the clay, are going to take another few minutes. It could be 10 minutes or 15 minutes to really settle out. And then the clay, the particles are so small, they can stay in suspension in the water for up to a couple days. So you want to just set the jar aside and not touch it. And eventually, as you can see in these pictures, you will have very clearly defined layers. And you can pretty much estimate the percentage of each type, each soil texture in there, different particles. So that's kind of a fun exercise if you've never done that before or are curious what your soil texture is. So now we're just gonna move on to some of the practical considerations.
Yeah, and Lisa, can I just interject again something? I asked Lisa to go into a couple of practical problems that I see with growing roots or root crop. The one is what she calls the compaction. the size, but also the shape. Compaction is your soil is just too tight, too hard to get through. And this can be this can be one layer in the soil that sits like half a foot below your level. When the roots hit that hard pan, as it's called, they will grow vertical, they will grow horizontal. And you don't want that because that gives it less value. And also, if the deeper they grow, the more food they can get. Where if they stay on one level of the soil, it's only what sits in that one level. The shape, so that's one side, is the shape. The size is important. If you have a hard pan, the roots have a tendency to get really fat above the hard pan and then have a lot of smaller side little roots, which obviously you don't want because the smaller roots just have lesser meat, there's less value. The challenge, of course, the deeper your roots are, the harder it gets to harvest, which can be made easier with adding more harder particles like a compost. The other thing I wanted Lisa to explain is the nematodes, because for me that's like something I totally don't understand. There are good nematodes, there are wrong nematodes, so hopefully she can answer this one. And then regarding the management strategies, I get a lot of questions of people that ask me, what can I add? Can I just add A, B, or C? And I'm like, I don't really know. I feel uncomfortable to answer this question. And so that's hopefully Lisa will give us all the ins and outs on that one. So you get it back, Lisa. Thank you.
Yeah. So there are, like Henriette pointed out, it's really helpful. Yeah, she's kind of helped guide this presentation to talk about the individual considerations. Soil compaction, if you have a very clay soil, again, adding organic matter, whether through compost, high quality compost, or cover crops. She had mentioned to me that a lot of people like to add sand or grow directly in sand, which seems a little impractical. And ultimately, you'll be reducing like the nutrient quality of the soil. So, maybe people have different experiences with that, but not something I personally would recommend. You could, do some double digging depending on the area that you're working to make sure that the soil is loose enough for roots to get down there and grow straight. Nematodes, there are both beneficial and pathogen nematodes. And the one we're talking about here are root knot nematodes. The bottom picture there is a pretty extreme case of root knot nematodes. That is something that can really be handled through, there's certain cover crops. I'll show a couple slides of some cover crop species that can help with that. Practicing good crop rotation, very important. You want to make sure that you're rotating crops with non-root knot nematode hosts. And there are there's plenty of options there. So you're not really limited, but making sure to rotate your crops is important there. Again, cover crops, compost. So really promoting beneficial bacteria in the soil that can actually keep nematode populations in check. Very important strategy. And in terms of adding fertility, root crops, phosphorus is a much more important nutrient for good root formation than nitrogen. So a lot of people focus on the nitrogen aspect of fertilization and just kind of lay it on. But in this case, you want to focus more on go easy on the nitrogen, which is going to promote leaf growth. Don't skip too much, but it doesn't need to be the greatest source of fertility. And instead, give an extra serving of bone meal or rock phosphate. Are both really good sources of phosphorus that are going to help promote that root growth. Another important thing for growing nice long straight roots would be the way that you're watering. Make sure to water deeply rather than short frequent durations of water. Water deeply and then let the soil dry out slightly, not to the point that it's cracking or that it's bone dry, but you want to give it a chance. If you water frequently and shallowly, then the roots are going to spread out more along the surface and you're going to get lots of smaller kind of side roots and not really a good shape for sales. And then I just wanted to share some interesting research, and I share some references at the end. There's not a lot of great research in the US on medicinal herb growth. But China and India have done some great research, and I found this study, a Chinese study on the quality of astragalus roots correlated with different soil health indicators. And it showed a definite positive correlation with organic matter and a couple of other indicators with the medicinal constituents of astragalus root. So some very research-based proof that the quality, building soil health also increases the quality and the content, the oil content or the other medicinal content of the different herbs.
Lisa, can I interrupt you again?
Yes.
It's a question. The wood ash, it cannot be ash from my my wood stove.
Yeah, as long as you are, as long as you're not, burning treated wood or anything like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And wouldn't that change the pH of the soil?
It can affect the pH. Really depends on quantity. Definitely a consideration. In some cases, if you have acidic soil, you might be fine with the small amount that the wood ash is going to change.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there are other crops. There are other crops that don't like wood ash, crops like potatoes. So, if you're in kind of a mixed system with vegetables and herbs, you just want to be careful about adding that. Definitely do your own research about, conditions of wood ash.
Somebody just asked an interesting question. Would you be able to use ash from bamboo?
That's a good question. I do not know the answer to that. Yeah.
It's not really something we have that much available on the Eastern Shore here, I think. So, yeah, it's worth looking into because that's a way of getting rid of the bamboo.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Let me see if I have more questions regarding this. Lacey asked, how would you use wood ash? You just spread it out.
Yeah.
You just throw it on there.
Spread it out. You could also, if you are growing compost, you could mix it with your compost. So it's not, to kind of bind the particles to something else. Like any powdery amendments, it's always kind of nice to mix it with compost.
Yeah. Okay. And then how much to use? That's I do use wood ash, and I basically spread, and I don't know if this is the right way, but I just cover it with a very thin layer because I'm worried if I use more, it will impact the pH too much. If I add it to the compost, I always have the little slightly bigger pieces, and I just want to find those slightly bigger pieces here and there. You don't want to have too much. You have to be extremely careful, I think. Am I right, Lisa?
Yeah. You don't want to go too heavy on
just
that.
a thin layer. So with your compost, you could do like a very thin layer on every foot of compost that you add. That's kind of what I do. When I have added what would be normally worth a foot height, I would add another very, very thin layer.
Yeah.
And then sometimes, obviously, I'm getting tired of walking away with my wood ash. I need to get rid of it, and I just dump the whole thing in the compost. But then later, I have the issue that the compost gets very hard to stir. So you don't want to do that. You absolutely want to spread it.
Yeah, and another consideration with any source of phosphorus is whether you already have high phosphorus in your soil. I think we have attendees from, some different areas here, but here in the Chesapeake region, phosphorus is a huge consideration. And so we don't want to over apply it. We want to be pretty judicious with it and also apply it at the right time. So it's good to get to know the needs of each crop when they need certain nutrients for different plant physiological functions and try to time it. So, not always just putting everything on all at once at the beginning of the season, because we don't want to lose it into the water or down through the soil profile. So this is just a couple of examples of cover crops that have that can really help with managing soil pathogens like root knot nematodes. Both mustards and marigolds have biofumigation properties, and that can really help. They also promote the population of antagonistic bacteria in your soil, and those antagonistic bacteria are the ones that are gonna feed on the pathogen nematodes. And as a bonus, they're very beautiful to look at. I think we're probably all pretty familiar with marigolds as a companion plant. Not as many people growing it as a full-on cover crop, but it's very useful in either context. And you can see this chart, which is kind of what's happening there. The plant constituents kind of releasing into the soil, and helping promote those through the exudates, promote those beneficial bacteria.
So Lisa, with a practical question, what particular issue would you start using marigold?
Marigold, yeah, they are. If you have any kind of soil pathogen, like a fungal pathogen in the soil, they have antifungal properties, but also good for nematode control.
Okay.
In the case of mustards, you need to incorporate the mustard into the soil for it to take an effect. But in the case of marigolds, it's both the above and below ground parts of the plant that are serving, different functions. And I don't know that they're entirely sure, like all of the different functions that are being promoted by which parts. It's kind of currently being researched. I haven't found a lot of definitive research about that, but they do know that it's working. They know a little more about the interaction with mustards in the soil as a biofumigant.
And Lisa, could we use calendula instead? No, calendula is a totally different plant than marigold. It's just the name is confusing.
I have not heard of calendula in that context.
No, there's so many more tests that can be done, because that would be so nice if we could use calendula.
Well, to do some small research trials.
I know. I'm planning on.
Yeah.
Next year we'll know better.
Yeah, and I would encourage that at home too. A lot of the data that we have from companion planting and interplanting, a lot of it is anecdotal, and we could always use some small on-farm research trials would be really helpful. So these just a couple more cover crop options. The one on the left is a great mix of rye and Austrian winter peas and clovers. And that really just as a biomass building, that was an overwintered cover crop that I let go a little too long in the spring, but it really did add a lot of organic matter to the soil, a lot of biomass. And then the one on the right is an overwintered tillage radish and oat cover crop. great for breaking up compaction, and most often will winter kill, leaving you with a pretty clean seed bed. So you can get out in the field very early in the spring without having to disturb the soil at all. It leaves the soil very friable. Also has some allelopathic properties, meaning it helps inhibit weed seed germination. A word of caution about allelopathic plants, though, rye is also one, is that if you're going to be direct seeding, it can also inhibit the seeds of the plants you want to grow. So always good to leave a couple of weeks after you incorporate something like a rye cover crop to make sure it doesn't mess up your seed germination rates. So on to shoot crops, or leafy above ground crops. They tend to be lighter feeders. They don't really need heavy fertility. So again, no need to over apply lots of products. Things like fish emulsion, bone meal, blood meal, cottonseed meal, azomite as just an overall kind of micronutrient source. They really respond better. They found that there's a higher oil content in plants that are grown with fertilizers that release over a longer period of time, so are less soluble, so that the plants are getting more of a steady stream of nutrients rather than highly soluble nutrients that are going to be taken up all at once. So these are some examples of good sources of nutrients like that. Again, mulching for water and weed regulation. Weeds can compete for nutrients and water and light in the soil. And water regulation, very important for that good root formation, and that whole biological process. It's all a biology drives biology. So always thinking about healthy plants are feeding more exudates in the soil that are feeding the soil microorganisms. And that's how the cycle continues. So everything you can do to keep living roots and keep that biology and that biodiversity going is really what you want to aim for.
Lisa, often I hear a theory that when you grow medicinal herbs, that in the nature don't really grow in a very rich soil. If you feed them too much, you give them too much fertilizer, their quality, they will be big, but their quality will go down because they're spoiled. They don't develop enough of the constituents that are actually useful for a medicinal herb. Do you know if there is a relation in the chemical situation and the amount of feed that we're giving plants?
Yeah, there is there is evidence, there's research supporting that the oil content, the medicinal constituents and the oil content in herbal crops are higher when you use these less soluble fertilizers. So they're light feeders. They don't want a lot of nitrogen that's going to promote, really big leaf growth. Instead, you want it to work a little harder. A lot of the medicinal components are actually part of the plant's own immune system that then have some of the same properties when applied as a human medicine. And so not that the plant needs to be really stressed, but it needs a chance to kind of build up its own immune system. So I think it's a good point to bring home.
A practical question: if you buy a bag with fish emulsion, should you use like half of the advised amount, or should you go for the full amount that's based on vegetables?
I would dial it back.
Yeah.
I mean,
I always for when they are growing outside my herbs, I use half of the advised amount, and that seems to work.
The other thing about the recommendations on the bag is that that is using the total amount needed by the plant as guidance. And it doesn't take into consideration at all the fact that you already have some of these nutrients in the soil. You know, they already exist and they're part of the biological process. So a soil that has a healthy microbial activity is already making nitrogen that's available to the plant. In a lot of cases, you might not need to add any nitrogen. If you have that healthy soil that's, you know, has a good amount of organic matter and a good microbial activity. So so most of those recommendations definitely exceed what you need.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And then again, intercropping or companion planting, if you know, if you're planting large amounts of something, always good to consider what can go together. There's a lot of guidance out there on companion planting. As I said before, a lot of it is anecdotal. But if you think about attracting pollinators or the fact that, you know, the more different species of plants that you have in a different area are going to promote the different microbes in the soil. You know, basil and tomatoes is the classic combination. And I think that one is pretty much proven to benefit both plants. The basil can provide some antifungal properties to the tomatoes, fight off fungal disease. And so there's some really strong evidence out there for some combinations.
So we should all start growing holy basil and tomatoes.
Absolutely.
Two valuable crops.
Yeah.
Good.
And marigolds. There are some marigolds in there too. And then think about your crop rotations, making sure that you are, you know, on like a 4-year, and consider whether you can have an extended fallow. So, you know, setting up your system so you can take land out of production to have, you know, a full year of good cover crop mixes in there to rebuild the soil. Ultimately, it's going to serve you much better. You're going to maintain the soil health and no longer run into fewer pests.
Somebody has their microphone on.
So slightly different situations for perennial shoot crops. You know, they're in the ground. How are you going to practice a good rotation with a perennial crop that's always occupying the same ground? You don't necessarily, you know, you might need 2 or 3 years of growth to get something harvestable. So again, looking at intercropping, you know, how can you add that diversity either by intercropping with other perennial crops or with annual crops, and, you know, spacing things out so that there's room to add other crops throughout the season. Maybe, you know, cut flowers could be a great option, especially if you grow native types of cone flowers. Both attracts pollinators, you know, can be a host to beneficial wasps or praying mantises that are going to greatly benefit the system. You know, keeping the ground covered again with mulch so you don't get that drying and cracking, and helping regulate the moisture. Definitely pay attention to the type of compost you're adding. Really important. If you're going to use compost in addition to or as a replacement for cover cropping, which a lot of people on a smaller scale do because they don't feel like they can give up the space for cover cropping, make sure that it is a high quality compost, that it's fully cooked, you know, that it has a good microbial community, that the feedstocks were quality, and that it has the right carbon to nitrogen ratio. And you can send compost samples to a lab to get tested. And I would really recommend that unless you are making it yourself and you're very confident in your compost making abilities. Very easy to spread disease through compost that hasn't been kind of fully cooked. And I know Henriette also pointed out the problem of extending the life of short-lived perennials. So, trying to keep them healthy for longer, even though you're going to have to move them eventually, getting the most out of their life in a certain area. And that's another place that I would really think about compost applications. So after your last harvest of the year of a particular, there's good airflow in there. And but then ultimately, it's a short-lived perennial for a reason. It wants to move to new areas, and if left on its own, it would spread by other means.
Yeah, and the lemon balm is a really good example of that. It will move.
Right. Some other intercropping ideas. There's a study showing that lemongrass and lemon basil, when grown together, both benefited from. They both had higher essential oil yields when they were intercropped in a study from India, and higher yields and better economics for the farmers growing it as an intercrop. So a really good example of some great herb crops that benefit from intercropping. Again, like native flowers, coneflowers, pollination and predatory wasps. A lot of those native flowers can also deter things from your vegetable crops if you're interplanting vegetable crops. Things like cabbage moths or deterring aphids. And another way to intercrop would be to consider having a living mulch in your pathways. So, even if you are monocropping in the bed because it's easier when it comes harvest time, or, it's just for crop planning reasons, you just really don't feel like you can intercrop in the bed, adding that diversity in the pathways. So you could do, just a low growing clover or a mix of clovers and grasses that may need to be mowed. And then a few opportunities for cover crops that can also, be cash crops. Technically a cover crop is just grown for its associated benefit, whether it's building organic matter or, trying to control a pest or a disease or nutrient scavenging. But there might be some situations where you could consider harvesting some of your cover crop and still get those benefits. So buckwheat, factor of pollinators, and you can leave some of that to go to seed, harvest it, and have your own buckwheat flour. The drawback there, and with some of these others, is when they go to seed, you can give yourself a little bit of a weed problem. But in most cases, something like oats or buckwheat as a weed are not as bad as some other weeds that you're dealing with. So they tend to be pretty easy to pull and not as much of a nuisance. So it could be worth it. Australian winter peas is another one that's a favorite of mine. You can grow it over the winter, and in the spring, just the very tips, the shoots are a great green, a great salad green, or for like cooking. They're delicious. It doesn't take away any of the benefit of the cover crop as long as you're not harvesting it, too aggressively. It's really just that tender tip. And then tillage radish and oats is another popular combination for an overwintered crop. And if it's a little thick, you can definitely go out there and steal some of those tillage radish when it gets to a harvestable size. Great eating. And then the oats, whether as part of a combination or a strictly oat cover crop, you could also let some of them get to that milky stage and harvest them. They're used in teas or as the seed, for if you do a hulless oat for things like that. So nice to find some win-win cover crops as well. And finally, More on
Can
cover
you
crop.
excuse me, can you repeat what you were saying about the oats and getting milky? Your connection was kind of off.
Oh, sure. I know that, so you can grow a hulless oat to use as a grain, or you can allow the oats just to get to their milky stage, which is before they're completely mature. And I know they're used in teas and things. Henriette, maybe you can give a little
Yeah,
more.
the milky oats is a fantastic calming medicine. The only thing is you need to harvest them just on the right moment. When you smash them, they have a white milky stuff coming out. And if you wait too long, you're too late and you have regular hard seeds. If you pick them too early, the seeds are still green. So it's a matter of going out in the field and testing that on a regular basis. The disadvantage with any of these, if you let them set seeds, then you will not be able to get rid of them. There will be some weeds left, which in the case of oats is not too bad because they're very easy to pull out, but something to consider.
Mhm. Great.
Lisa, are you later? You're still going to talk about how we terminate these cover crops? Okay.
Yep.
And then
Next slide. Next slide after this one.
You have 8 more minutes.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, just a few more ideas for cover crops here. I know that having a later harvest with a lot of herb crops can make it seem like it's not possible to get a cover crop in. These are some strategies for getting a cover crop in that case. A late planted rye and clover or rye and peas, some kind of a mixture can thrive in this area. Undersowing with clover, that we do that a lot with vegetables. You can plant it in late summer and it's starting to get established, then you harvest the crop in the fall and the cover crop is already there and established. And you can also frost seed. If you miss all of those late summer or fall windows, midwinter on the cold, you can broadcast your seed, and the freezing and thawing of the ground will actually let the seed get incorporated, and you can end up with a good kind of late winter, early spring cover crop. And some good species for that would be clover or bird's foot trefoil, very small seeded crops. And then finally, make sure that you know how you're going to terminate your cover crop. Come in with a plan. Mowing helps. If you have a flail mower, that's going to chop it up much smaller and make it break down more quickly, which is helpful. If you are then going to incorporate it, it's going to help it break down in the soil more quickly in smaller pieces. Sometimes you might not want it to break down quickly. If you're going to leave it on the surface, you might want it in bigger pieces so that it creates a mulch. It keeps the soil cover and it persists for longer into the season. Roller crimping, if you're a larger operation and you have a tractor and you're interested in rolling it down, that works well with just certain types of cover crop. It works well with rye, but the timing is very important. But, some people do that and they plant into it. They just, after it rolls down and it dies off, you kind of separate it and you can plant right into the soil. Conventional farmers would roll it and terminate it with an herbicide as well. And then tarping is a great way on a smaller scale. So just a heavy black tarp, depending on the temperature outside in the summer, you might just need to tarp it for, maybe 2 weeks. When it's colder out, it could take a little longer, a month or, up to 2 months for it to actually kill the crop. But it means you don't need to disturb the soil at all. So that can be a really good option. And then, like I showed in the picture of the tillage radish and the oats, those are winter kill cover crops. And then you don't really need to do much of anything unless you have a warm winter like we occasionally have. And then you want to have a plan B, which might be tarping or tilling.
Mowing. just one thing about the oats to make clear: when you winter seed, when you seed your oats in the fall, it will probably die before it has the milky oats. The milky oats can only be harvested if you plant the seeds. Like here in this area, we plant the seeds right now, end of February, beginning March. If it's a little colder, you go a little later. So if you want to use the oats, plant the seeds in this time of the year.
So I know we don't have much time left, and I want to make sure we have at least a couple minutes for questions. There is this other study, and again, there'll be references slides at the end if anyone wants to dive into them more deeply. In this case, the addition of vermicompost was correlated with a higher yield and with methylonide content of ashwagandha roots. So again, just that's, you know, there's a lot of research showing that there is this link, that maintaining your soil health and building your soil health really does have a positive impact on the medicinal quality of your herbs. So, you know, we don't want to ignore soil health, you know, and just feed the crop and not consider about feeding the ecosystem that it's growing in. And in fact, by paying more attention to the soil health, you know, you are going to reap benefits to the quality of the herbs. And just, you know, high quality compost, vermicompost are great tools for that. Other organic materials to use as mulch, just making sure that you don't add too many raw materials directly to the soil. If you do that, then you incorporate them and you have the carbon to nitrogen ratio in the soil gets out of whack, and the soil bacteria will spend all its time and energy breaking down the new material and won't allow the nutrients to be available for your plants to uptake. So if you want to build soil by adding a lot of organic matter, just make sure that it's fully composted first, or that you leave it on the top of the soil as a mulch rather than incorporating it. These are some cover crop decision-making tools that are out there. Great book by Sarah called Managing Cover Crops Profitably, has a lot of information. I really like the Smart Mix calculator that Green Cover Seeds has on their website. And there's the Northeast Cover Crop tool. So some great tools out there that allow you to enter information about your particular needs, timing, goals, and we'll spit out some recommendations for you. Always consider a mix if it's possible. Some references, and then just another little plug for the Million Acre Challenge. Consider joining the challenge. It doesn't require you to do anything. It'll just get you a newsletter every month that'll tell you about some of the different resources that are available. And here are our various social media handles. So hopefully we can get a couple questions in now.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. Let me check the chat. I don't know if we're going to be cut off exactly at 1, but we'll see. Anybody has any questions? Just either speak
I did.
Yes.
I had a question in the chat. I asked if maybe if I missed it, I'm sorry, but for mulch, for mulch for our
I saw that, yeah.
For our herbs, be they medicinal or not, what are the best mulch options for a no-mow situation? Because for those of us who are working out of beds and bags and pots.
I like straw mulch. You do occasionally get some seed that will germinate in straw mulch, but generally, again, it's not one of the worst weeds to deal with. I find it holds up well, so you know, it's not gonna break down so quickly that you need to mulch again, you know, weeks later. So that would be my
the advantage of straw also is when it rains, the water will splash up from the straw, but it will not bring the soil onto your plants. So that's an advantage where you have a little bit less when you work with wood chips that have more tendency to be partly covered with the soil. So the disadvantage of the straw is that it might have seeds, and so you might get some some plants.
If you use bedding straw, you won't get the seeds. Bedding straw doesn't have any seeds in it, so you won't have that problem. But
Right.
bedding straw.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. You can also let your bale of straw get wet if you're getting it directly, you know, like from a farmer. Let it get wet. The seeds will germinate, and then after
use it.
that, you can spread it.
Okay. Well, we are at our time. Thank you everybody for listening, and I hope everybody learned a couple of practical things. If you have any questions, please email me or Lisa, and we will get back to you. And again, what I said is anybody that wants just the slides besides the video, send me an email and I will make sure that you get the slides. Thank you again, and let's somehow keep in touch with each other.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.